In this session, we'll be looking at the spinal reflexes. So the first thing we need to understand here is that there is a sensory type of reflex and a motor type of reflex. Okay, when both of these are integrated, it results in something called the sensory motor integration. Okay, so when sensory component and motor component work together, we are calling it as sensory motor integration. Now let's look at the components of the reflex arc. So it will obviously start from the receptor, right? So receptor is the organ which receives the stimulus. From here, the stimulus goes via the afferent nerve, that is via the sensory nerve. Okay, it gives the afferent input and relays it to the center, that's nothing but your spinal cord, right? So obviously from the spinal cord we get our motor output, that is the efferent output, right? And finally this results in what is known as response. Okay, so the receptor receives the stimulus and it goes via the afferent input to the center, that is the spinal cord, and from there the output is sent via the efferent nerve and a response is elicited. And this entire process is termed as the reflex arc. Okay, please memorize the components of the reflex arc, they're pretty easy. Now let's proceed to the stretch reflex. Stretch reflex is the simplest reflex. Okay, stretch reflex is also known as the simplest reflex, and here obviously a stretch induces contraction of the muscle. That's simple to understand. And the most famous example for this is the knee jerk elicitation, which we have all done in our clinical cases, right? So what happens here, the muscle that we are stimulating is the quadriceps femoris. Okay, from here when you hit it with the knee hammer, it results in a passive stretch of the muscle. Okay, here the receptor will be the muscle spindle. Okay, so the receptor for the stretch reflex is the muscle spindle. Now let's understand the structure of the muscle spindle. So this is how a muscle spindle looks with its intrafusal fibers. Each spindle has 3 to 12 intrafusal fibers. Okay, so the intrafusal fibers per spindle are 3 to 12 in number. Now let's look at this intrafusal fiber in detail. This is the center of the intrafusal fiber, which is the receptor. Okay, that is, this is the afferent component, and both the peripheral ends are innervated by gamma motor neurons. Okay, so the center is the receptor and the peripheral ends are innervated by the gamma motor neurons. Now let's look at the muscle spindle innervations. Now what you're seeing here, these circles, these are the nuclear bag fibers. Okay, this is nothing but a collection of nuclei inside a bag like structure. We'll assume that this is the bag and these are the nuclei. That is why these are called as nuclear bag fibers. Okay, now this is known as nuclear chain fibers. Here the nucleus is arranged in the form of a chain, okay, one after the other. That is why we are calling it as a nuclear chain fiber. And what we have to understand, very important point for the exam, the primary afferent, okay, that is the annulospiral ending or the group 1A fibers innervate both NBF and NCF. However, group 2, that is the secondary afferent or the flower spray ending, that's the group 2 nerves, innervates only the NCF, that is nuclear chain fibers. Okay, B and C. So C comes after B. So 1 innervates both B and C, 2 is only for C. Okay, group 2 innervates the nuclear chain fibers. Now let's look at the efferent innervations. Okay, the gamma motor neuron that innervates the nuclear bag fibers is known as the plate endings. Okay, and the gamma motor neuron that innervates the nuclear chain fibers is known to have trail endings. Okay, nuclear bag fibers, plate ending, chain fibers, trail endings. Now why are we learning so much about these bag fibers and chain fibers? Let's understand their significance. So the nuclear bag fibers are responsible for the dynamic muscle response. That is, they are responsible for the dynamic muscle length changes. That is, when the muscle is acting, the nuclear fibers are active. And the nuclear chain fibers give something known as the static response. Okay, so it is concerned with a stretched muscle, mainly with its length maintenance. Okay, nuclear bag fibers are for changes in the length and nuclear chain fibers are for maintenance in the length of the muscle fiber. Now let's look at the stretch reflex arc. So we know that the first component obviously is the receptor, which is the muscle spindle. From here, via the sensory afferent, The input will be group 1A and 2. We have just seen where are these, okay. These go and relay to the center, that's nothing but your spinal cord. From here, the alpha motor neurons are stimulated, okay. These are present in the extrafusal fibers, and in the spinal cord, the alpha motor neurons are stimulated, which gives the efferent output, okay. So this efferent output will ultimately result in our muscle contraction. Why? What is known as actin-myosin interaction. We have seen this in our skeletal muscle class, right? So the alpha motor neurons are stimulated, which send out the efferent output and stimulate the muscle contraction by actin and myosin interaction. So the most important point we have to note here is this type of reflex is known as monosynaptic reflex, okay. This stretch reflex we are calling it as a monosynaptic reflex. Now let's proceed to alpha motor neuron and gamma motor neuron and compare each of them. So the alpha motor neuron always causes a direct muscle contraction, whereas gamma causes an indirect muscle contraction. Alpha direct, gamma indirect. So the alpha motor neuron goes and innervates the extrafusal fibers, that is, it activates the extrafusal fibers, resulting in the actin and myosin effects that we have just seen. Now what do the gamma motor neurons do? They cause activation in the periphery of the fiber and stretch the central part of the receptor, okay. The gamma motor neuron activates the periphery and stretches the center. This ultimately results in muscle contraction. Now let's look at this concept of alpha gamma co-activation. As the name suggests, obviously they are activated together, okay. So what is the mechanism over here? When there is a stretch, we know that there is contraction. Now the concept that you have to understand here is what happens when there is an overstretch. So when there is an overstretch, instead of contracting further, the muscle goes into relaxation, okay. This is very, very important. This relaxation is important because it prevents the muscle damage. Hence, it is a protective response, okay. This overstretch causing relaxation is a protective response, and it is also famously known as the inverse stretch reflex or the lengthening reaction. Okay, now let's learn about this inverse stretch reflex in detail. So let's start off with the components. The first one will obviously be the receptor, and please make a note here. The receptor for inverse stretch reflex is the Golgi tendon organ, okay? And the input will be nothing but an excessively outstretched muscle, right? So this Golgi tendon organ has about 3 to 20 muscle fibers. From here, the sensory input is given via 1B. This 1B further goes and takes the overstretch information to the center, and we know that the center is always the spinal cord, right? The group 1B neurons are stimulated, and these mainly act via glycine neurotransmitter. That is why these are inhibitory neurons, okay? So this is known as Renshaw cell inhibition, and this neuron is known as Renshaw cell neuron. We have learnt about this in our previous classes, okay? So from the center, an inhibitory message is sent via the neurotransmitter glycine through the Renshaw cell neuron, which causes an inhibition of the alpha motor neuron, ultimately resulting in muscle relaxation, and hence the reflex arc is completed. Now let's quickly revise. So the receptor for inverse stretch reflex is the Golgi tendon organ. Each has about 3 to 20 muscle fibers, and the sensory afferent is via group 1B. The overstretch information is taken to the center, and via the group 1B neurons, the inhibitory neuron, that is the Renshaw cell neuron, is activated. It is inhibitory because it uses the neurotransmitter glycine. So what is it going to inhibit? It is inhibiting the alpha motor neuron, ultimately resulting in muscle relaxation. Now very important exam point for you over here. This inverse stretch reflex is a disynaptic reflex. Please make a note of this point. It is a disynaptic reflex. Now let's have a quick comparison of stretch reflex and inverse stretch reflex. So the stimulus for stretch reflex is obviously stretch, and inverse stretch is overstretch. The receptor is the muscle spindle, whereas here we have seen it is the Golgi tendon organ. The afferents we have seen for stretch reflex are 1A and 2, and for inverse stretch it is 1B. The center for both, however, is the same. It is the spinal cord, and the efferent is also same. That is the alpha motor neuron. Then the response we know for stretch reflex is contraction of the muscle, whereas for inverse stretch reflex it is relaxation of the muscle. And the most important point we have noted, stretch reflex is a monosynaptic reflex, inverse stretch is disynaptic reflex. And the function is mediated by muscle spindle. Length changes in the muscle are the main characteristics of stretch reflex. Okay, so this is known as a length sensor. And here inverse stretch, that is mediated by the Golgi tendon organ. Here the tension changes are noted by the receptor, so it is known as the tension sensor. Okay, stretch reflex length sensor, inverse stretch reflex tension. So the next concept we are looking at is the polysynaptic reflex. Okay, the mechanism we will discuss is the withdrawal reflex. Okay, suppose you are pricked on your right foot with a pin. What happens? Obviously you will withdraw your right lower limb backwards. That is, there is a flexion of your right lower limb. So all the flexors are activated and obviously extensors should be inhibited so that flexion can occur. But what you have to note is there is left lower limb extension also, not just flexion of your right lower limb. Your left lower limb undergoes extension. Okay, so here obviously all the extensors are activated and flexors are inhibited. This is mainly done to maintain the posture of the person. Okay, so polysynaptic reflex, the most famous example is withdrawal reflex. Now let's look at the next concept called magnetic reaction. It is also known as positive supporting reaction. Okay, it is a spinal reflex. That means the center is in the spinal cord. Let's understand this with an example. If you apply pressure on the footpad of a mouse, that is a lab mouse, there is limb extension to maintain support and hence maintain posture. That is why this is known as positive supporting reaction. It is supporting the posture of the mouse. When you apply pressure on the footpad, there is limb extension. This is known as positive supporting reaction, and this is an example for magnetic reaction. The next one we are looking at is the mass reflex. Okay, many spiral segments are involved in this reflex. That is why it is known as mass reflex. Again, the center is in the spinal cord and it is mainly seen in paraplegics. So what is it? When a mild painful stimulus is given in paraplegics, it is followed by profuse sweating and a rise in systolic blood pressure up to 200 millimeters of mercury, and there is a bowel and bladder evacuation also. This is known as mass reflex.